Yeah, so this is the beginning of part two. Now, brothers, I just want to go back to this original image, as you can see from the royal lines of Zerah and Perez. As you can see, both the lines of Zerah and the lines of Perez, they came together via the kings of Ireland, because as you can see on the left-hand side, um, the kings of basically the Milesian kings, they got their lineage from the Cretan kings, who were the descendants of Zerah. And now we know, based on what we went over earlier, that the Milesians were of a Celtic Irish stock. Okay, so right here is just going to be more detailed information about the Iberians, just so brothers can understand that the original inhabitants of that region were people of color. And for those of you who've never read this book before, this is a book called Ancient and Modern Britons. It's volume 1 by an author called David McRitchie. Great read, great read. But let's read. The Iberians are styled swarthy and curly-haired. The word swarthy is rather elastic, for although literally Schwartz, by the way, that word Schwartz or Swartz, that's where you get the word Stuart from. Because again, that's another way of saying black. But continuing on. Yet it is taken, I fancy, to mean something not quite so dark as the color of a Negro in its usual acceptance. And that's the author David McRitchie trying to throw his little barbecue in there. But even he'll admit that he's mistaken. Continuing on. Perhaps this distinction does not exist. But at any rate, if the small, dark Highlanders and the black Celts, the west of the Shannon, be assumed to be the descendants of the Iberians, it may fairly be argued that, with so much intermixture with fair races during the last 2,000 years, the stock must now be lighter skinned than them, and its representatives of the first century may have been actually as black as Negroes. As a matter of fact, Pliny characterizes their complexion as Ethiopian, that is, as black as an Ethiopian, and it may be that the curliness of their hair was of the same nature as a Negro's also. That's exactly what that means. But continuing on, thus the Negrotos of Huxley, the owners of such skulls as those found in the Caithness, may have been aligned to the ancient Iberians. That the wild tribes of Ireland were black men is hinted by the fact that a wild Irishman is in the Gaelic a black Irishman, dubbed Arainic, and that some of the natives of Scotland as well as England were of this race also is evident when one remembers that according to Skene, the powerful tribe of the Demoni, which was the chief of the confederate of the I'm gonna suck with pronouncing these words, the confederacy of the Metetai or marsh dwellers, who are a part of the Picti or Colandoni, were probably relations of their namesake of southwestern Britain, which indeed is almost a certainty if a nomenclature goes for anything. And by the way, that's just not limited to British Ireland and Scotland. The French, the Russians, the Germans, all the even the Danish, all the original inhabitants of Europe were from this Celtic stock. But continuing on, therefore the British Picts resemble the Ligurian Picts and the Tasmanian and other kindred Picts not only in the using of similar customs and weapons, but also in their most striking physical features. Now let's continue on. Now, when Claudian wrote, and for a long time after, Moris signified a great deal more than a native Mauritanian, or it may be more correct to say that Mauritanian implied as much, though in a different quarter, as Cynthia did. Any Latin dictionary, any old one at least, by the way, this is letting you know that a lot of the dictionaries we have today, they change the meanings of words. For example, the word brunette. Today, we're told that a person who has brunette is talking about hair, but in the medieval times, brunette was in reference to their skin color. Same with olive skin. They tell us that, quote unquote, someone who's olive skin represents someone who has a tan. But in the medieval times, someone who was olive skin, meaning they were dark brown, damn near black. But continuing on, any Latin dictionary, any old one at least, will tell you that Moris is a blackamoor or a tawny Moor, and Shakespeare used the word Moor as a synonym for Negro. As that last word bears nowadays a somewhat restricted meaning, it may be better to take the old-fashioned blackamoor as the nearest English rendering of Moris, signifying thereby any black or brown-skinned man. Consequently, the translation of Claudian's line is this: he subdued the nimble blackamoors, not wrongly named the painted people. And the British Picts, like those of other lands, stand out again as dark-skinned men. So again, letting you know that the people of the British Isles, and by extension, the original inhabitants of Europe, were or people of color. And by the way, that name Morris, since it means Moor, that's where you get words like Maurice, Murray, words along those lines. Those all tie back to being black. So brothers, for those of you who don't know, this image right here, this is a picture of Charles I, the son of King James of England. Now, like I mentioned earlier, Charles I was killed during the end of the English Civil War in 1649, and he was removed from power. And that's when the Commonwealth of England was established from 1649 to 1660. This was basically under the rulership of Oliver Cromwell. Now, it was during that time period that Interregnum that many of the the artwork, the statues, the paintings depicting so-called black men as ruling figures were destroyed because of so much the amount of animosity and hatred that the serfs and the peasant class of people had for the ruling black men. But of course, that interregnum period was a brief period, and then we had the Restoration under Charles II. But that's really the person who I want to focus on. For those of you brothers who don't know, Charles II was known as the quote-unquote black boy for how dark he was. Let's get an image of Charles II. So for those of you brothers can see, this is an image of Charles II, the son of Charles I. I know it's a little bit hard to see, but as you can tell from the features, this is clearly a man of color. Now this right here is a statue of Charles II. It's a little bit, allegedly it was weathered down due to natural weather like rain and things like that. But honestly, it wouldn't surprise me if they chipped away at the features over time. Now, for those of you who don't know, because Charles II was called the Black Boy, throughout England, there were certain inns called the Black Boy Inn. But let's get into this article real fast. Charles II, King of England, a descendant of the Moorish Medici bloodline. In his account of captivity in Morocco in 1680s, Thomas Phelps recalled meeting with an ancient Moor who formerly had been a slave in England and spoke good English, and who was set at liberty by our late gracious King Charles II. Another captive/slave was the Cossier of Abdallah bin Asia, who spent 3 years in England and was released by King Charles without ransom upon the intercession of James II. And by the way, James II was a brother of Charles. Moors have been present in Europe from classical times. In the 2nd and 3rd centuries, Roman soldiers of African origin served in Britain, and some stayed after their military service ended. Continuing on, another source. The restoration of the monarchy began in 1660, when the English, Scottish, and Irish monarchies were all restored under King Charles II. The more after the Republic that followed the Wars of the Three Kingdoms, or the English Civil War. There are several historical references referring to Charles II as having a black complexion or as a black boy. It was a nickname for him coined by his mother because of the darkness of his skin and eyes. Pubs across England called the Black Boy are generally named after Charles. Since the early 16th century, the Black Boy Inn hotel in Caernarfon had been welcoming weary travelers and visitors to the town of Caernarfon and region of Snowdonia. And by the way, the Black Boy Inn isn't the only remnant of companies owned by black men in Europe that still have that image of a black face. There are many other companies, but you brothers can do that research on your own time. According to Black Boys Inn and B in Berkshire, the word Stuart comes from the Old Nordish word Swart, and which means black. Stuart is the same as swarthy. And by the way, that spelling of Stuart, S-T-U-A-R-T, that's the Frankish way of spelling Stuart. The English way is S-T-E-W-A-R-T. So that's why that spelling of Stuart was like that, because I believe King James's mother, who was Mary Queen of Scots, was raised in France for a period of time and adopted that spelling of Stuart. But y'all brothers can correct me if I'm wrong on that. There was once a Stuart line of kings in England. The name of the founding ancestor was Stuart, which means black man. Stuart kings of England and Scotland, King Charles II, also lovingly known as the Black Boy of England by his subjects. He is commemorated in the celebrated name of the Black Boy Inn, found all over the British Isles. King Charles II was a black man. Now continue on, another source. At this time, we disagree with the Black Boys Inns BB in Berkshire that Stuart comes from the Old Nordish swart. Swart is the root of swarthy, and Charles II is described as having a swarthy complexion, and alternatively a black complexion. Thus, we do not need Stuart to derive from swart in order to authenticate the description that Charles II complexion was black. Meaning what? It's not just based on his last name that the reason he's black, because his contemporaries described him physically as a black man. Stuart is the French form of the Scottish surname Stuart. The French form of the name was brought to Scotland from France by Mary Stuart in the 16th century. Which was Mary, Queen of Scots. Continuing on though. Stuart, name meaning Scottish, originally an occupational name for an administrative official of an estate. That's meaning the word steward. Because like I mentioned earlier, the first steward of Scotland was a man named Walter Fitz Allen. He was given that title by David II. Now, David II was a descendant of Kenneth a Dove, who, like I mentioned earlier, was from that McAplen line. Specifically, now how you trace the King James lineage. King James was a descendant of David I, who was the son of Malcolm II, who was, I believe, the nephew of Kenneth Niker. Now, again, to link up that lineage, for those of you brothers, like I mentioned earlier, the first Stuart king of Scotland was Robert II. His father was Walter Stuart. He was the sixth High Steward of Scotland. His mother was Marjorie the Bruce, who was the daughter of Robert the Bruce, who was the king of Scotland, who was descended from that McAplen line. So that's how you're able to trace the lineage. But let's get the definition of swart. Old English, swart, black, dark, of night, clouds, also figuratively wicked, infamous. That's why many times in history there'd be a title for someone called the Black, because it referenced not only to their skin color but also to them being a great wicked force. In fact, there was also other princes who are known as the Black for their title. For example, in England, the son of Edward III called Edward the Black Prince. Now, conventional history will teach you that Edward the Black Prince, he was called that because he wore black armor, and that is true, but it wasn't just his armor that was black. It was his skin that was black. And he was also a great famous warrior, a great, basically a conqueror. That's why he was given that title, the Black Prince. But continuing on, source also of Old Frisian, Old Saxon, and Middle Dutch, swart, Dutch, zwart, Old Norse, zwart, German, Schwarz, Gothic, Swartz, dark colored black, from Pi root, Swardo, dirty, dark black, the true Germanic word surviving in the continental languages but displaced in English by black, meaning prior to that term black, that term swarth or swarthy was used for people of color, of skin color of persons from the late 14th century. Related, swarded, source, swart, swarthy, alteration of swarthy from Old English swart or black. For swarthy, swart means black, source, Nordic name. Here you go, this is the depiction of the Black Boy Inn, free housing, but as you can see, that's a Negro right there. Another image of the Black Boy Inn, a pub. Look, as you can see, a Negro. Another image of a Black Boy Inn, as you can see, image of a Negro. Now, this is where the Caucasian throws their little barbecue sauce, because this is supposed to be the white-niced image of Charles II. But as you can tell, honestly, he kind of looks like a Hispanic. But that's what they do a lot of times when it comes to historical figures. They'll have a white-niced version of what they really look like. So, like, because sometimes you got to mix fiction with reality to convince people. So, this is a fake image of Charles II. Now, let me go back to that original image that I showed you of Charles. Right here is a more authentic image of Charles II. As you can see, clearly has the Negro features. Now, right here is another image of the Black Boy. Now, The reason why I found this picture is because what's described below is actually very interesting. The Black Boy, Avery Hill, near Effingham. This is a very attractive local community pub hidden away within the post-war suburban of Avery Hill. There is a public bar and a lounge with a pool table and jukebox. The lounge also provides access to a large and pleasant garden to the rear. There are 400 pumps, and real ale has been introduced. Currently, Courage Best is available, but the landlord is hoping to stimulate demand so that more can be introduced. Now, this is the most important part right here. The name and sign commemorates the 29th Worcestershire Regiment of Foot, which during the 1700s and early 1800s had black boys serving as drummers. Now, why is that? Because during the 1700s and the early 1800s, Europe was still being run and controlled by people of color. So the soldiers during that time period would still been black men. That's why the drummers were so-called black boys. So for a lot of you brothers who don't understand this, when it comes to our people's rulership in Europe, we were there until the late 1700s, early 1800s. It was many of the deportations that removed our people. For example, the Highland clearance, or another one being the Jacobite risings that removed a lot of the people, or even the deportation a lot of the Jews in regions of Spain, Portugal, and all throughout Europe for religious reasons. Those were many of the reasons why our people slowly over time were pushed out of Europe. But since I mentioned a couple of the uprising, I think there's something we should go over. Now first, we want to talk about the Stuart Restoration. The restoration of the Stuart monarchy in the kingdoms of England, Scotland, and Ireland took place in 1660 when King Charles II returned from exile in continental Europe. The preceding period of the Protectorate and the Civil Wars came to be known as the Interregnum, again 1649 to 1660. The term restoration is also used to describe the period of several years after, in which a new political settlement was established. It is very often used to cover the whole reign of King Charles II, 1616 to 1668, and often the brief reign of his younger brother, King James II, 1685 to 1688. Again, the reason why he was opposed, King James II, he was removed by Parliament because he converted to Catholicism in what was known as the Glorious Revolution. Continue on. In certain contexts, it may be used to cover the whole period of the later Stuart monarchs, as far as the death of Queen Anne and the ascension of the Hanoverian King George I in 1714, for example. The Restoration Comedy and typical encompasses works written as late as 1710. And again, due to the Stuarts losing their influence and power in England was the rise of the Jacobites. And that Jacobite rebellion or Jacobite rising, specifically in the year 1745, was one of the major reasons why many of our people were pushed out the region. But let's get into that. Let's get into the definition of Jacobite or Jacobitism. Jacobitism was largely a 17th century and 18th century movement that supported the restoration of the senior line of the House of Stuart to the British throne. The name is derived from Jacobus, the Latin version of James, meaning what? James is a Scottish version of the name Jacob. But continuing on, when James II and VII went into exile after the 1688 Glorious Revolution, the Parliament of England argued he'd abandoned the English throne and offered it to his Protestant daughter Mary II and her husband William III. In April, the Scottish Convention held he fortified the throne of Scotland by his actions listed in the Article of Grievances. The revolution created the principle of a contract between monarch and people, and that was violated, he or she could be removed. And one of the violations of that contract was not being a Protestant, because again, the Church in England and the Catholic Church were at odds with each other. But continuing on, Jacobites argued monarchs were appointed by God or divine right and could not be removed, making the post-1688 regime illegitimate. While this was the most consistent difference, Jacobitism was a complex mix of ideas, many opposed by the Stuarts themselves. In Ireland, it meant tolerance for Catholicism, which James supported, but it also meant granting Irish autonomy and reversing the 17th century land settlements, both of which he opposed. In 1745, clashes between Prince Charles and Scottish Jacobites over the 1707 Union and Divine Right were central to the internal conflicts that ended it as a viable movement. Now, this right here is an image of Prince James Francis Edward Stuart, or also known as Prince James III of England. This was during the time period where he was rebelling. This would have been when King George I was made king of England after the death of Anne in 1714. Now, King George, like I mentioned in the first part of the video, was of that line of Hanover. So the Jacobites, specifically James III, believed that since he was not a direct lineage, he was not of direct descent from James of England, he did not have that divine right to rule. Because again, the British at that time period, since they understood that they traced their lineage from David, and they understood the lineage was based on basically the seed line of the man, it was through that man's specific seed where they were given that divine right to rule. So in their mind, George had no right to the throne of England. Now this is going over the Jacobite rebellion. So the Jacobite Rising of 1745, also known as the 45 Rebellion or simply the 45, or the Year of Charles, was an attempt by Charles Edward Stuart to regain the British throne for his father, James Francis Edward Stuart. Again, James Francis Edward Stuart, that's James III, the image that we just saw previously. Continuing on, it took place during the War of the Austrian Succession, when the bulk of the British army was fighting in mainland Europe, and proved to be the last in a series of revolts that began in 1689 with major outbreaks in 1708, 1715, and 1719. Charles launched the rebellion on the 19th of August 1745 at Leffernon in the Scottish Highlands, capturing Edinburgh and winning the Battle of Prestonpans in September. At a council in October, the Scots agreed to invade England after Charles assured them of substantial support from English Jacobites and a simultaneous French landing in southern England. On that basis, the Jacobite army entered England in early November, reaching the Derby on the 4th of December, where they decided to turn back. Similar discussions had taken place at Carlisle, Preston, and Manchester, and many felt that they had gone too far already. The invasion route had been selected to cross areas considered strongly Jacobite, but the promised English support failed to materialize. They were now outnumbered and in danger of having their retreat cut off. Their decision was supported by the vast majority but caused an irretrievable split between Charles and his Scots supports. Despite victory at Frankfurt Muir in January 1746, the Battle of Culloden in April ended the rebellion and significant backing for the Stuart cause. Charles escaped to France but was unable to win support for another attempt and died in Rome in 1788. Now, I'm sure a lot of you brothers know that because of this Jacobite rebellion or Jacobite rising, many people were deported out of the England and sent to the Caribbean, specifically places like Jamaica. But let's get some information on that. Right here is an exact list and description of the 150 rebel prisoners that were taken due to the Jacobite rebellion. But let's get into these brothers. Let's read. Robert Adam, 18, laborer, Sterling, Brown, William Bell, Weaver, Burrick, Black, curled hair, strong maid, Douglas Campbell, servant, Brown, complex, well made, ruddy. Again, and look at the date, October 1746. These are all black men that lived in England. Douglas Campbell, servant, Argyll, Brown, Alex Davidson, ruddy, slim made, and by ruddy, it means he was of a lighter, a reddish complexion. Andrew Edwards, black, well-made, strong. John Grant, black. Alex Grant, brown, lank hair. John Johnson, brown. David Joyner, brown. I believe that's John Kennedy, black, well-made. Will McLean, well-set, strong, ruddy. But y'all brothers get the point. Let's get a quick description. This list is taken from 3 different Gaols, Lincoln, York, and Lancaster, and it is likely that the first 46 prisoners, whose names are all alphabetically arranged, will come from Lincoln, the other names from York and Lancaster being inserted without any regard to sequence. Of the 135 men, 18 hailed from Perthshire, 20 from Overns, 25 from Aberdeen, 19 from England, 1 from Ireland, as to the trade represents. 55 were laborers, 11 servants, 20 weavers, 4 herdsmen, 2 gentlemen. Number 105, John Mackenzie, 22, Rossshire, well-made, genteel, and number 111, John Ulster, 20, Lincoln's brown hair, genteel. There was an Edinburgh writer, George Hume, age 30, marked as a black man whose color would no doubt suit the West Indies. Meaning what? The people of the West Indies, or the Aboriginal Americans, were also people of color as well. But continuing on, one man, number 104, a laborer, is noted as having his own hair. A wig was hardly to be expected from one of his class or his age. He was only 32. Then there is a fiddler from Averns of about 16 years, 5'1" feet in height, who is happily characterized as sprightly. The following other occupations were represented: sailor, watchmaker, carpenter, whitesmith, peddler, halo chandler, hosier, mouster, shoemaker, baker, bookbinder, flax-dresser, nail-maker, glover, gardener, cook, tailor, husbandman, plowboy, cowherd, the wainer, and last but not least, 2 barbers. Number 92, Walt's Minutes, would probably be Walter Menzies. 5 of them were hot-picketed, and not one of them all was 6 feet in height. As many as 60 were under the 20 years old. Now, right here, I'm going to go back to the list of men so y'all brothers can get a quick look at them. Let's read at the bottom. This description was taken by Mr. Smith at Lincoln, York, and Lancaster in October 1746. So what? As late as 1746, there was still a large black presence in Europe, man. This right here is an excerpt from writings of Benjamin Franklin called Observations Concerning the Increase of Mankind. Now we're just going to read this last portion here to close the video today. Which leads me to one remark, that the number of purely white people in the world is proportionally very small. All Africa is black or tawny. Asia chiefly tawny. When it's talking about Asia, it's talking about the Middle Eastern regions extending all the way to like Pakistan, Afghanistan, India. It's not talking about China, Japan, those areas. But continuing on, America, exclusive of the newcomers, wholly so, and in Europe, the Spaniards, Italians, French, Russians, and Swedes are generally of what we call a swarthy complexion, as are the Germans also. The Saxons only accepted. By this period, the what are called Caucasians had adopted that term Saxons. But the original Anglo-Saxons, like we read throughout the earlier writings, they were of that Celtic black stock. So these people who called themselves Saxons by 1751 were usurpers. And that's what Caucasians do. They conquer a race or nations of people, and then they take their history and adopt it for themselves. There's nothing new under the sun. We can even go far as back for those of you brothers who read the scriptures. When you read First Maccabees, after they conquered specifically the Macedonians under Antonius, what's his name? Antigonus Epiphanes, when they came and conquered the region and began to set up basically the abomination of desolation, and they made it illegal for Israelites to openly practice their religion. Well, what did they do? It mentioned, I believe, in the 2nd chapter, they went whole unto the books and then began to paint themselves as the image of the people. Even when you go into the Greeks of Alexander, when they conquered that original region of Greece, those people prior to Alexander coming there were people of color. But once he conquered that region, he adopted their religion and culture for themselves, and then they began to be called Greeks, even though the original Greeks were people of color. But let's read it again. And in Europe, the Spaniards, Italians, French, Russians, and Swedes are generally of what we call a swarthy complexion, as are the Germans also, the Saxons only excepted, who with the English make the principal body of white people on the face of the earth. I could wish their numbers were increased, and while we are, as I may call it, scarring our planet by clearing America of woods, and so making the side of our globe reflected a brighter light to the eyes of inhabitants in Mars or Venus, why should we, in the sight of superior beings, darken its people? Why increase the sons of Africa by planting them in America? Where have we so fair an opportunity, by excluding all blacks and tawnies, of increasing the lovely white and red? but perhaps I am partial to the complexion of my country, for such kind of partiality is natural to mankind. And that is a fact. And by the way, for you brothers, that's why Caucasians go through such lengths, specifically the scholars, to cover up the history and paint themselves as always in power. It's always, when you're in power, you're always going to be partial to your own race of people. You're always going to make things easier for them and harder for everybody else. So for you brothers who get into certain discussions with other races of people about history, honestly, it's fruitless because there's no benefit for them to understand the truth. Because at the end of the day, the history and power is for them to believe that quote unquote black people or the Israelites or quote unquote black people are the rulers of Europe. That does them no good. That doesn't empower them. Not only weakens them. So honestly, the only thing you should focus on is your edification, your upliftment, you becoming powerful due to that understanding the truth. But yeah, with that, I just want to give this close this video out, man. Y'all have a great rest of your day.